Welcome to the Superintendent's Hangout, where we discuss topics in education, charter schools, life in general, and not necessarily in that order. I'm your host, Dr. Sciarretta. Come on in and hang out. In this episode, I turned the microphone over to my daughter, Maya, and she did the first of what will become an occasional series of guest hosting on the Superintendent's Hangout. The goal of Maya's conversations with me is to, first of all, for us to have some lighthearted banter, but also for her to ask me some questions about my life that may shed a little bit more light on my work in educational leadership and maybe even some of the conversations that have been happening on this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this new version of the Superintendent's Hangout. Welcome, Maya, to the Superintendent's Hangout. And for our listeners, this is the first in an occasional series of guest hosts. So at this point, I'm changing from host to interviewee. So take it away.
Hello, everyone. I am Maya Sciarretta. You may recognize my voice from an episode way back, but I am here to interview my dad, and we're just going to be going with the flow, seeing where the conversation takes us. But I think the first question that I'm going to ask, I will be plagiarizing from Terry Gross, and I'm just going to be asking you to tell us about yourself.
That's a broad question.
I'm going to keep it broad.
And since I've been on this earth for more than a half century, we'll see where to start on this tale. I was born in Dunkirk, New York, in upstate New York, right near the border between the U.S. and Canada, near Niagara Falls. And most of my formative years were spent in what at the time was called Spring Valley, New York. It's a kind of a suburb bedroom community of New York City. But spliced in there was about 3 years living in England, where my parents went when I was very young. I actually learned to walk on a transatlantic ship ride, supposedly. Well, that part's not supposedly. That really happened. I think my parents were trying to save money on transportation, and in those days, air travel was a super luxury and very expensive. So we took a boat from New York to England, and I always say that's where my superior balance comes from, because I learned to walk on board a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. And then, I grew up in a family of educators. My mom, my dad, my stepdad, they were all involved in education and teaching and administration. And I tried my hardest to get out of the profession, and had, I think I went through college under the assumption that I was going to go to law school, even though I didn't really know what that entailed. The legal profession was very different 30 years ago from what it is today in terms of options. And so, most people were just thinking about, you're either going to end up in a courtroom somewhere, or you perhaps going into corporate law at some level, or maybe you're going into government service. So I was kind of plodding towards that. I'm not going to call it a fate, but that path in my life. And then after my junior year in college, I went to college in Maine. I did my undergrad work at Bowdoin College in southern Maine. Bowdoin College is a small liberal arts college that at one time was known as the Harvard of Maine, because it was founded in the 1790s, and it was really In fact, at that time, it used to have a medical school attached to it. And it was started really to educate. At the time, Maine was very sparsely populated, but it was really meant to provide a high-quality education. And there's a whole family of those types of colleges across the Northeast, Williams and Middlebury, and I'm going to space on a lot of other names, but anyway, it's in that ilk. So I was at college in the summer, and I'd lifeguarded the previous 2 summers, and I was like, I kind of want to do something different. I knew I needed to earn money. So, I wanted to stay on the campus because my friends were there, et cetera. So I was looking around and I saw a sign. First of all, I interviewed for jobs like in retail, and I didn't even get a call back, and that's good because I would have been terrible. You had to fold shirts and stuff like that. And then I saw this sign and it said, handyman wanted. And so I called the number, and it turns out that it's this woman named Ann Pearson. And Ann Pearson was like an admin assistant in the School of Education at Bowdoin College. And she was near retirement, and she had bought an beautiful old farmhouse in Maine overlooking the Penobscot River, I think it is, near Bath, Maine, where a lot of U.S. battleships and submarines have been made over the years, and at Bath Iron Works. And so anyway, I'd never met Ann, and I called the number, and she's like, yeah, come for a meeting. And I go to her office, and she's got like her golden retriever there sleeping under the table, and like this, what's going to happen? And she's like, look, I can only pay you $2.50 an hour, $2.50 an hour. But the good news is it's under the table. You don't need to pay taxes. I'm like, oh boy. So anyway, it's either that or nothing. This is 1992, I think, 91, 92. And so I start working at her house and doing handyman kind of stuff and painting, and we put in a patio and all this stuff. And one day I'm there, and she's like, it was very nice. She would bring me lemonade in the afternoon because it was like hot. It was like July or August, so humid. And she comes out and hands me this pamphlet. I'm like up on the ladder, I remember. And she's like, can I talk to you? What are you going to do after college? I'm like, I'm going to go to law school. And she goes, do you want to go to law school or you're going to go? And I'm like, no one ever asked me that. Why are you asking? And she said, well, I'm on the panel for this fellowship called the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. And she said, well, there's only, you're never going to find something like this ever again. This is a fellowship that if you receive it, they give you a lump sum check, which in those days was $15,000. And to put things in perspective, I think Bowdoin in those days cost $18,000 a year all in. And, I was on financial aid, intense financial aid. I was one of 4 kids. And so that was a lot of money in those days. And so she hands me this pamphlet. And she's like, just take a look at it. So I threw it in the back of my car and didn't really pay attention for a couple of weeks. And then one day I was like looking at this thing. I'm like, interesting. This is before internet, so there's no URL to go to. But there was a number on there to call. And so I call, and they're like, hey, here's the process where you apply. Long story short, thank God, but Ann Pearson was on the committee at Bowdoin that helped screen out screen applicants rather, that were applying for the Watson. And then from there, it would get referred to the national level, et cetera. So I had 2 interviews at the college, and I'm pretty sure that Ann Pearson really helped me. So thank you, Ann. And one thing led to another, and 4 or 5 months later, I'm sitting in an interview room in the middle of a blizzard in southern Maine. I remember the guy was flying in from somewhere, and he was like 2 hours late to the interview. And we had a great interview, and then I was awarded the Watson Fellowship. So that really, I always tell people, and young people, and anyone who's only focusing on the money, that had I turned down this $2.50 an hour job that, obviously I was not doing for the money. Had I turned that down, I might never have met Ann Pearson, might never had those conversations, and might never have ultimately been on the Watson Foundation journey and fellowship. And we can talk about that too at some point. But that's just a little bit about me. I came back from a Watson Fellowship for more than a year in Central America and started teaching in San Diego in a charter school, kind of on a whim, thinking I was only going to do it for a year or two, and now it's now I'm going on 29 years. I'm about to finish year 29, and I'm still here, and it's a great career. So there are a lot of ways that the octopus can crawl on this one.
Yeah. I think one thing that stuck out to me was the fact that you did not want to go into education. You didn't want to follow in your parents' footsteps in any way. And is there something deeper behind that? Or did you just, let's psychoanalyze the situation. No, did you just want to try something new and forge your own path? Or was there something about the work that your family did that just didn't appeal to you on a deeper level?
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to have met Freud in person. No. It's a great question. It's kind of been the defining tension in my life. So, I think there's always something that growing up, and I'm the oldest, I'm firstborn, and was always the type A overachiever. And I think growing up and seeing, so my immediate family, my parents worked in a private school my whole life, so not very well paid, didn't have the pensions or even health insurance at the level that maybe their peers across town who were working in a public system earned. And then, this is its own ball of wax, but they worked in a Waldorf school. And on my podcast, I've touched on the topic of Waldorf education prior, but it was started in the 1920s after the wreckage of the First World War in Germany. The first school was in the Waldorf Astoria cigar factory. That's where the name comes from. And the education is very different. It's kind of in the ilk of Montessori, but also departs in areas of spirituality. There are some things that I think they've been powerful forces in my life for my own role now as a superintendent in education, but then there have been some things that I'm still puzzling over after 53 years of thinking about it. But anyway, suffice it to say that I always felt like my educational experience was weird in a negative way vis-a-vis people who didn't have that experience. And by extension, that meant what my parents did was weird, and they were weird, and I wanted no part of it. I didn't want to be poor. I put that in quotations because that's a relative term. But in my simplistic mind, I didn't want to be this poor kid. I wanted to do something real big and flashy. And you're talking about me growing up in the 80s in New York, so you see the Wall Street images and the Gordon Geckos of the world, and it's just a different time. And I grew up around parents who, were at board meetings all the time, and this committee and that committee. And I was like, this is no way to earn a living. This is lame. This is that. And so I thought, I'm going to be a lawyer. And I was always, I think, decent at writing and reading and analyzing, and a good memory for those sorts of things. I thought, this is pretty good. Incidentally, when I was in 10th grade, I took this test. You could take these predictor tests that would supposedly tell you what profession you'd be good at. You had to ask all these questions. Do you like big groups of people, small groups of people? Do you like to serve? Do you like all this stuff? And I came out, my number one area that was predicted for me was as a soda jerk. And most people don't even know what a soda jerk is. you're probably just fixated on the jerk part. A soda jerk was in old-fashioned soda fountains. It was the person who pulled the lever, pulled the tap lever. They jerk your soda. They serve you a soda. So
I never knew
my
that.
daughter, I need to tell you, our lives could have been very different. You might have grown up at a soda fountain. I think that's what they were called. But anyway, I think the test was really outdated, and was probably something
Did that even exist when you were growing up?
I've never been in a soda fountain, so no. I mean, they probably did in small towns, but no. So I think that's one kind of formative thing for me, was that I was fixated on the material side. I didn't really appreciate the degree to which educators can have a profound effect on your life direction in a good or bad way. And as I've gotten older and as I've become a parent and seen, patterns keep repeating in society and can see what happens when a population is not educated and isn't supported with developing critical thinking skills, then we have over and over and over and over, we're doomed to just repeat this cycle where people vote against their best interests. They fall for real catchy, flashy, oversimplifications of life. And they don't delve any deeper. Everything is 1 and 2 minute attention spans. And so, when I first started teaching in 1994, I also wasn't doing it for the money. I think my first salary was $18,000 a year. Now, in the 7th or 8th inning of my own career, and probably past the 50% download place on my life, I realized that I've been able to influence thousands of people over the years. And so that gives me satisfaction. Hopefully more of that influence was positive than negative. But I know that I'm, not infallible, and I recognize that. So that's really what was behind me kind of wanting to get out of the family business. And I have my mom, my dad, my stepdad, 2 of my brothers, my uncle, my cousin, my other cousin, and I'm probably sister-in-law. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm probably missing some. There's people in education all over the place. I think at one point we went on Ancestry.com and we were digging back, and there's some guy in England in the year, 1048 who was like a scholar of some kind.
So I think one thing that I would like to know is the way that your position now as superintendent connects to the very building blocks of the school community, which aside from the students are the teachers.
That's a great question. I think that my experience as a teacher, and even prior to that, my experience as a student, and I attended Waldorf schools, preschool through 12th grade, and then I went to a private college for my bachelor's. So all of that informed, and I think continues to inform, my work and my view of the classroom. I know it can be excessive at times or perceived that way, but I am an ardent believer in aesthetics and mood and environment and its connection to teaching. And it seems commonsensical, because none of us would like to have a chaotic home that's loud and smells bad and disorganized and is not thoughtful, because it's stressful if we went home to that every day. But we have classrooms that are not intentionally organized, and there's not a lot of thought to how they look, how they feel, how they sound, how they smell. And one of the things that I did, I think there were two things that got me my first teaching job because I was completely unqualified. Didn't have a teaching credential. In those days, you could go into a charter school and not have one. But two things. One, I had written a report, a summary, a narrative about my time living in Central America. And at the end of my interview, I slid it across the desk to the principal thinking he wasn't going to read it. A week went by. He calls me to tell me I don't have the job. And then the next day he calls me back and says, I just read your paper and I want to give you the job. So that was one factor. But the other factor was in my interview. So the way it worked is I took a tour of the school first. So they led me around. I went into the classroom. I went into the classroom of the teacher who I was going to be replacing. There was a teacher who had taken a job somewhere else. He just wasn't just having success at the school, et cetera. So they needed a hire replacement, and I was vying for that position. So I went in, and the classroom was just chaos, clutter everywhere. In those days, you had these desks where the materials went in from the front, and just jam-packed full of, I mean, it looked like when you stood behind where the students were, it just looked like every desk was a hoarder. And so in the interview, he's like, well, what's one thing you would do day one? And I said, well, day one, I would tell all the kids to dump their desks into a big pile, and then I would identify 5 things that I wanted them to keep in there, and everything else goes. So the guy's looking at me like, what? So when I got the job, he told me, hey, that comment has stuck with you. You're not nearly as qualified as the other people, but because of the essay and because of that comment, I'm going to take a risk on you. So I've thought about that over the years, that in hiring brand new folks who are just out of college, just out of a teaching credential program, some job has to be your first job. That's just how it's going to be. So I think about that and the opportunity that was afforded me. And I think I was a lot less qualified than a lot of the teachers that I see coming in who've had a 4-year degree and then a 5th year of credentialing and their student teaching. And I never did any of that. I think so there's that. There's the aesthetics. I pay attention to that, and it's been a mission of mine, and I probably won't totally win this. I'm not sure it's a winnable thing, but it's an observation that, and it's backed up by research. And I've had a previous conversation with Dr. Doug Fisher, who's a world-renowned educational researcher, about the impact of classroom environment on learning and student just kind of mental clarity and anxiety and how those go together. And I was saying that, and I go into not only classrooms at Einstein, but just around the state and sometimes around the world. And the average classroom in the U.S. is so cluttered, like beyond, it's like the closet that never got cleaned out. And there are little glints of fashion from 2023, but then there's also fashion from 22, 21, 19, 18, going back to when the teacher started their teaching career. There's just layers and nothing ever goes away. And I would like to find a way, before the end of my career to shift that dialogue so that classrooms are as aesthetically pleasing as, for example, the classrooms that I remember as a Waldorf student, but then also I saw as an adult going into classrooms at Waldorf schools. As intentionally focused as some classrooms I've seen at Einstein, but also at other places where you can walk in and say, okay, this is what the focus is for today. This is what the goal is, the intention. There's a calming sense that comes with that, as opposed to walking in and there's a barrage of input and there's student work from the previous July and you're already in May. It's got little stars next to it. And it's like, that's really great for the star kid, but I'll hazard a guess very few people are even ever looking at it. And it's certainly not current. So there's a symbol and a signal and a message that comes with everything we do in classrooms. every way we act around students, what we say, what we don't say, what we do, what we don't do. So those are things that I also bring in to try to think about the work that we do as administration and that my principals do with teachers. Let's see, what's another thing? I've experienced what it's like to be isolated in a classroom where your colleagues are doing what they're doing in their classrooms, and each classroom is kind of its own fiefdom. And one of my driving passions in my work today is to try to continue the spirit of collaboration and kind of breaking down some of those silos. Education, if not given the opportunity to collaborate, education can be a real isolating profession, where a teacher goes in their classroom or they're in their content area and they do what they do in there because they, quote unquote, know what they're doing, unquote. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But if you're a student and you're a family and you go through a school, you go through the grades, you go through the content areas, and every teacher is kind of doing their own thing, it's a real discombobulating and unsettling, or can be, experience for learners when there's not a common theme, a common philosophy, at least a common understanding of the way that we, whatever the institution is, the way we teach this, the way we look at this, especially because you're working oftentimes on foundational skills with students. And so to have such a wide range from one classroom to the other, it's confusing. It's confusing for students and for families. I think the other thing that I bring from my experience as a teacher is that I remember 1,000 times, if there's one time, needing to be flexible and adaptive with lesson plans, with approach to the day, with common sense. And so planning is important. Knowing what your end goal is important. But just as important are the qualities of being flexible and adaptive, because if not, you get locked into this plan, you become an automaton, you get stressed out when you can't stick to the plan. You're dealing with human beings. You're a human being as a teacher, so it's impossible to think this is just like a Henry Ford assembly plant. It's not. These are human beings, and you're going to have people coming in someday, and they're just not ready. And so to find that balance between having a plan that's moving us forward and it's intentional, and then on the other hand, recognizing the humans in the room, there's that. I mean, I could go on and on about kind of the learnings that I had, because I taught for 12 years. And so, and then there are things that I never experienced, and so I'm perplexed by them. I think in education, there's by and large, and I'm saddened by this, there's a bifurcation between leadership, administration, and teachers. And when you look at the history of even the word principal comes out of principal teacher, the first teacher, the most effective teacher. And we've taken that in society and completely changed it to where principals are jacks of all trade, and they're running this meeting and that meeting and writing this memo and approving this, expenditure from the PTA, and on and on and on and on and on. And so there's this divide that happens. And I didn't feel that when I was teaching, but I know it's a thing. I know it's a us and them kind of thing. There's a kind of a dark side that you move over to once you move into like either formal leadership administration or quasi. And so I reflect on that sometimes. And then I think most of my most powerful learning experiences came through stories. And it's one reason that I've embraced even this podcast is that I like to hear people tell stories. I think we learn and remember through story. It's the oldest form of communication and multi-generational, transgenerational conveying of values and narrative, etc. And so I think the teacher that doesn't take advantage of the power of that doesn't mean stand up there and lecture the whole time, but it's just as powerful to hear the stories of students in the room. The teacher that is overly preoccupied with silence in a classroom because silence is a proxy for everyone being on task, which I think we can all say is silence is also a proxy for being half asleep or just being compliant because you don't want to be called out. I mean, I've sat in classes in my educational journey where I didn't know what the hell was going on. So, yeah, I just stayed silent too because I didn't want to attract any attention. Yeah, so I mean, I could go on and on. I think my experience as a teacher also underlined for me that if there's not a healthy relationship and respect, a human interaction between the teacher and the students, the learning's going to be limited. I feel like I've had really powerful teachers who, to this day, college professors to this day, I can email them. In fact, one of my most influential college professors, Dr. Penny Martin, will be on this podcast in short order. But I also had educators who I think were destructive. And I remember all of them. I remember their names. I remember when it happened. And I'm someone who's been in school for, 25, 30 years of my life. And I still remember those moments. So I think, I'd like to get to a place where I could raise my right hand and say, at Albert Einstein Academies, at no time, under any circumstance, is there ever an adult yelling at a child. And I don't know if I can unilaterally say that. And that's not a criticism of Einstein. I don't think there's any, or there are very few leaders of, we have 165 adult staff members. And, I get it. People have hard days, and sometimes they're made harder by what they face at work. Sometimes they're made harder by what they bring from home to work. But we remember, as kids, we remember those interactions forever. So I think I'll stop there.
I know when I was younger, teachers yelled at us on a daily basis. You say you can remember every instance. I can't because it happens so often. But obviously the fact that they kept having to yell at us shows that maybe it wasn't the most effective form of discipline. Because I think it scares students, but it doesn't do much more than that. So, yeah, I think definitely it's interesting to see the ways that, your unique path through education from being a student to an administrator has really informed how you've carried yourself at every step of the process. I think I'm going to do a rapid fire session of just random fun questions.
Okay, throw out a topic.
What's your favorite color?
That changes. When I was a kid, it used to be red. My brother Pete was blue, and we used to get in fist fights about that. I think as I've gotten older, it's probably like a sea green, okay. Foam green.
Are you colorblind?
I don't know, but I think I partially am. Because there are times when I'll say, could I see that? Could I see it? Could you please, at a store or whatever, could I get this in green? And they're like, there is no green. I'm like, it's right there. It's gray. So, yeah.
Okay. What's your go-to Starbucks order? And then do you have a different order when you go to other coffee shops?
Spoken like a true hipster from college. It depends on the type of day I'm having. I vacillate between matcha latte. That's been a new up and coming one. No sweetener. Flat white, which is also a latte. No sweetener. That's a coffee latte. And then sometimes I'll just get a tall coffee with room so that I don't spill it everywhere. And I usually, when I go to another coffee shop, I'll get a cappuccino.
And what's your favorite book? Or if you can't choose one, do you have a favorite author?
Yeah, I could go a whole bunch of different directions on this one. I don't know if I have a favorite author. I have authors where I try to read everything they've read. I read more nonfiction than fiction. John Krakauer, I think the guy's a genius for narrative nonfiction and his research, and it takes forever to write his books. Excuse me. I wish he could write them a little faster, but it's worth the wait. I like probably my number one book of all time was Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, because I can remember where I was when I read it. I was in the backyard of my grandma's house in my first visit to Los Angeles in about 1982 or 3. I remember reading the book that summer. It's a beautiful book. I think it destroys Moby Dick, but that's just me. Recently, I've been reading and listening to as many books from Don Winslow as I can. He's got his Border trilogy, which is powerful nonfiction, but really realistic and disturbing nonfiction about the international drug trade. And because I live on the border, that's something that I've taken an interest in, and so well written. And in fact, almost even, I hate to say this, but almost even better on Audible, because the narrators who he has are just fantastic, and you can just get lost in the story. Cormac McCarthy, All the Beautiful Horses, which ultimately was made into a Hollywood movie, but his other books as well. I think Outer Dark was one of his, and he has a very unique writing style, and it's one of those things where he's kind of the Picasso of modern novelists. He violates the rules of grammar and syntax all the time, but very intentionally. I could go on and on. I've been an avid reader since the time I was, since as far back as I can remember.
So when I was little, you and Mom would always turn on NPR in the car, and I think that has definitely informed my passion for podcasting and radio. Was that an intentional choice for you? Did NPR spark your fascination with podcasting, or did it happen in a different way?
I grew up in a household, and if you learn a little bit more about Waldorf education, this will make more sense, but I grew up in a household with limited to no media. And so we didn't have a TV or a television set, as we called them back in those days, in the house until I was probably 15, 16 years old. And got to a point and I wanted to listen to the radio, mainly to listen to Yankees games on the radio. And so my mom said to me, "You can have a radio, but you have to build it." And so I went to Radio Shack and got a crystal radio set. And my grandfather, who during World War II he worked on setting out the telegraph lines so that the soldiers could communicate with each other. So he was pretty tech savvy in the technology of those days and knew how to solder and all these different things. So we put together this crystal radio kit. And I remember it only had AM radio and it didn't have a speaker because we got the cheap one. It had an earpiece just for one ear. I remember you clicked it in, put this little uncomfortable thing in one of your ears to listen to the radio. But that happened to be a bonus because that meant that I could listen to the radio at night in my bed, even after I was supposed to be in bed. So, my parents would say goodnight, and then I would turn on the radio and listen to talk radio late into the night. I've always just been into reflecting on different modes of communication, and I think I've been a fairly early adopter on different technologies. And so when I got my first iPod, about the time right around when you were born, maybe just after, so 20 years ago or so, I got an iPod. And at the time, these different services came out where there was this thing called the podcast. And I was like, that's weird. And I remember figuring out a way to get it on my iPod some mornings and going for a run. And it's like, wow. And none of the shows were that good or whatever. They were just people just talking about stuff. But I thought, wow, this is an interesting technology. It's free. It really doesn't have the constraints of time. The airtime's not expensive. So if you want to go 10 minutes or 100 minutes, it's the same. It's just the size of the file. And then from there, I just started to get more and more into listening and kind of more disillusioned with commercials. So there's that for the podcast. But I've always been a public radio listener, certainly for the last 30 years or so in California, KPBS. And I think that it was a choice that I felt like it was an extension of the storytelling that we did to you when you were a kid. And, but putting you to bed, I used to tell you a story every night. And some real and some made up and some read and whatever. But I feel like it's all an extension of that. And so NPR tends to be longer form stories that try to embrace more nuance, although there's no way they're without bias because that's not possible. And I think also the fact that NPR's shows with real topics, like even things like Car Talk. You and I used to listen to Car Talk, and now I don't think it's on the air anymore. One of the hosts has passed away, but even that, just two guys chatting and talking about cars, and it seemed like they had all the time in the world, and there was no rush. And I think those are important. Those are certainly important stepping stones for me in my navigation of life. And I think it was just a natural thing for you. I remember we used to pick you up in the car, and the first thing you'd say is, "Can you put on NPR?" No, the first one was, "I'm hungry." And then the second one was, "Can you put on NPR?" So that's just been part of what you've done. Yeah.
Well, I, for one, am very grateful that was just that storytelling was at the core of my childhood. And I think it's become a really important part of my life since. And I thank you and my mom for that. Yeah. And it's beautiful to see how that's played into your educational journey, into your professional one as well. Yeah. And I hope that you have all enjoyed listening to my dad's story and just feel like you know him a little bit better and have a deeper understanding of the philosophy behind the work that he does. And then you've also gained a couple of fun facts too. So thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks for coming in, Maya, and for being the guest host. It was great. We got to do this again soon. Thank you for listening to the Superintendent's Hangout. You can follow me on Twitter at DVS1970. Please be sure to share this show with friends and family on social media and in the real world. Thank you to Brad Bacayal for editing and production assistance, and to Tina Royster for scheduling and logistics. Thanks for hanging out, and have a great day.